objective Bayesianism, debates around infinity, things like countable additivity, and questions about what should be basic, right? What should we assume, and what should we derive? And then we'll open up to discussion. I believe that we're very comfortable at any point keeping this conversational, so interject, right? And we'll be happy to entertain, and we'll reserve the right to punch to the end if it would be more efficient that way. So let's start with a few chest thugs from some of the progenitors of the Bayesian tradition. Right. Here we have the good Reverend Thomas Bayes stating, the probability of any event is the ratio between the value at which an expectation, depending on the happening of the event, ought to be computed, and the value of the thing expected upon its happening. Right. This is one of our first definitions of probability within this framework, and notice it immediately connects probability to the notion of the value of what we would call a bet. Right. So probability is being interestingly defined by Bayes, right, in terms of this ratio of the expectation of the bet over the value of the bet. Right. You'll see a kind of introduction of notions of value in the definition of primitive probabilities in his account. Here we have Pierre-Simon Laplace saying the word chance then expresses only our ignorance of the causes of phenomena that we observe to occur and to succeed one another in no apparent order. The key passage is, probability is relative in part to this ignorance and in part to our knowledge. Right. And we have the extraordinary Frank Ramsey stating that we are driven, therefore, to the supposition that the degree of a belief is a causal property of it, which we can express vaguely as the extent to which we are prepared to act on it. Here we hear a different, right, but related connection between degrees of belief and propensity toward action. Right. And Definetti, the degree of probability attributed by an individual to a given event is revealed by the conditions under which he would be disposed to bet on that event. Right. And then we have a connection to an operation to elicit degrees of belief. Once again, in connection to action. Savage probability measures the confidence that a particular individual has in the truth of a particular proposition. Right? So what is Bayesian epistemology? After these evocative quotes, well, Ajay Good said that there are over 46,000 varieties of Bayesianism. So you're not going to get a pat answer. That said, I posit that one nice way to begin to categorize the varieties of Bayesianism, and also to identify their core shared commitments, is as follows. Right. One can ask our Bayesian interlocutor, what is the correct interpretation of probability? Right. Now they will tend to have interpretations within a family, right, that will be fundamentally epistemic, related in some way importantly to knowledge, behavior, value in various ways under different accounts. We can further ask them, in addition to the very core commitments of the account, right, regarding the conforming of our belief to the axioms of probability and the updating of those beliefs via conditioning, what further principles should we adopt? And we'll see a host of these candidates. And one can imagine the most austere commitments to a rich tropical jungle of commitments. So what are the justifications, finally, for the core theses of the account? And again, you might get quite different answers. And as we go along, we can also signal as Bayesians who have somewhat different background commitments, examples of how folk can differ along those things. Good. That said, there is something that unifies all these Bayesians, and we can also see what that is, what its lessons are. First, let's contrast Bayesian epistemology with classical epistemology. This is very sensitive, if you notice it going back and forth. That's the reason. Use the roller. So classical epistemology, at one level of simplification, is concerned with the binary notion of knowledge and its justification. Right. So, does one know something? Do they not? Right. And how does the structure of justification play into knowledge? Importantly, I mentioned that there are kind of unsolved and potentially unsolvable paradoxes with respect to the foundations of knowledge. Right. Whereas Bayesian epistemology focuses on questions of rational belief and learning, putting aside the binary notion of knowledge, right? And the stories around justification that accompany that account. That said, right, some of us, like Gerard, think that a Bayesian perspective is quite compatible with classical concerns over knowledge, and perhaps to a lesser degree to justification, right? While others think that it is at least in tension, well, we didn't update that with those concepts, and reveals them to be confused. Right? Some of us would be happy to jettison some of those traditional concerns and move on, while others think that they can keep working hand in hand. So central to the Bayesian account is the idea that beliefs should be represented as probabilities, the thesis of probabilism, and that these probabilities should be updated according to Bayes' theorem, initialization. Now, to make one more distinction, it might be nice to plant a flag down in the difference between Bayesian epistemology and Bayesian statistics. Right. One can think of Bayesian epistemology as a theoretical application of probabilities to articulating normative ideals for rational belief and learning. Right. For articulating something like a geometry of rational learning. Whereas we can think of Bayesian statistics as a pragmatic application of probability to solving problems in things like parameter estimation, hypothesis testing, model selection, and so on. Again, at one level of simplification, one might say that the project of Bayesian epistemology is to ask, how ought I change my beliefs? And Bayesian statistics to ask, how can I make reasonable inferences? Both valuable, but somewhat distinct, if interrelated projects. So let's begin with interpretations of probability. Right. What is a probability? When we talk about the chance of rain, the chance of a nuclear decay event in the next moment, right? When we place bets on the upcoming election, right? What are we talking about? When I teach philosophy of science, I love how many of my students feel it immediately obvious that they know what probability is. Right? This is an utterly, am I going backward?
Interesting.
Are we stuck in a loop? Is that? Do we,
Oh, that's different. How are you?
Are you sure the arrow of time is the right way?
How are you navigating this?
check this.
Crazy.
There should be starting off with a Russell quote here. All right, so Bertrand Russell says, what is going on? Okay.
Well, it's broken the screen.
Is it the right set of slides?
I think there was a picture of
Yeah, it looks like it.
It is the right set of slides. I wonder if there was some
Duplication. So there's Bertrand.
Oh, okay. Here we are.
There you go.
So, Bayesian epistemology then describes something, under one account, of an idealized model of belief and inference that can potentially help us in guiding our everyday efforts at rational belief and learning. I'm going to borrow an analogy from Yudkowsky that I thought was quite apt. What the Bayesian framework and model provides us can be thought of very much as analogous to something like the Cournot engine for inference. We have an idealized model in which we assume away certain wrinkles and complexities. We assume away the presence of friction, the loss of energy from the system, and so on. And we say, right, under under those conditions, this is what an ideal might look like. Right? And we can use this in our everyday engineering activity to try to improve, right, the systems that we actually work with. And for some of us, it provides something like that. Though, on some accounts, it's going to be very deflationary and very much a kind of engineering project, one more tool in our tool belt account that I would subscribe to. In others, it might be telling us something much deeper about the structure of things like rationality, about which one might have richer commitments. Does that sound fair?
Sounds fair.
Good. So let's view interpretations of probabilities. Right. And starting with our initial intuition that this should be an utterly unproblematic concept, and we have Russell here saying that probability is the most important concept in modern science, especially as nobody has the slightest notion of what it means. That's it. I think we've got a few accounts, and certainly Bayesians feel like they have some grasp on at least what it isn't. One standard category of interpretation of probability is in terms of the limiting relative frequencies of events. Right. So when I'm flipping a coin and you ask me, what is the probability of the coin coming up heads? I say, well, it's 50%. And you say, what do you mean by that 50% number? And that proposition, I say, if you were to hypothetically flip this coin infinitely many times, the limiting relative frequency of heads would approach 1/2. Right. Now, problems with this interpretation of probability are, first, one cannot assign limiting relative frequency to one-off events. Right. It precludes us from being able to talk about them. And indeed, right, some classical statisticians with strong philosophical commitments do adhere to these notions and will kind of rule out certain forms of Bayesian reasoning on the grounds that we can only talk about the limiting relative frequency of the error statistics on our tests. That's the only coherent use of probability. It cannot account for the knowledge dependence of many of our probabilistic claims. Like when we're making probability statements about what will happen in the election, right, we'll see that there are key issues, even about that coin flip, where knowledge dependence plays a critical role. Further, you have just technical issues like any finite initial sequence of events is compatible with indefinitely many continuations of that event. So, right, whatever I've observed so far is not going to uniquely identify any limiting relative frequency. Right? It's not going to even rule anything out. Further, limiting relative frequencies violate countable additivity. So, if you like that, that's too bad.
Can you say what you mean by that?
So, consider, we're actually working on what is the nicest, simplest example of that property is. You can take the disjunction of some sequences, each of which will have a limiting relative frequency of 0, as an example of showing this violation of countable additivity, and notice that their intersection, right, doesn't add up to 1, even though we're either going to be exhaustive of every number. So take the set of limiting relative frequencies that are like the frequency of precisely the number 1. Well, the number 1 occurs once, right? So its limiting relative frequency is 0. Number 2 occurs once, its limiting relative frequency is 0. Take the disjunction of the limiting relative frequencies of all numbers, you get 0. And yet, right, they should sum to 1.
I mean, but that's a dirty trick, because what you do is it's countable, so you have an infinite sum of infinitely small things, and of course we know that we play infinities against each other. They, they don't have to be compatible, and you can do anything you want if you just stretch the different scales differently. So that feels like, if in the moment I remove countable, say finite additivity, then the problem is done. Right?
That's right. If one restricts themselves and is fine with finite additivity, that last technical point is not a problem. That said, we often do want our mathematics to be well behaved, and there are debates where folks think carefully about what are the portions of probability theory that will be fully coherent and not beset by these sorts of issues.
If somebody is interested in more, there's one paper by Alan Hayek in problems with finite frequentism, and another paper by the same author, finite 15 problems with hypothetical frequentism.
So another class of accounts are propensity accounts, where now instead of defining probability, let's say, of that 50% for our coin flip in terms of these hypothetical limiting relative frequencies, we define it in terms of propensities. Right? And if you ask what precisely are these propensities, tend to be highly underspecified, but they have an intuitive appeal. Right? I'll tell you that it's something in the coin, that propensity to come up, right, at 50% of the time. Maybe it's subjective chances, maybe it's some disposition, some habit, and I can say a lot of words that are synonyms to disposition. And this gives us back things like one-off events. Now you can tell me why, if I only flip the coin once, right, it would come up 50%, why it is that, you know, a volcanic eruption can have probabilities assigned to it that I don't expect to be repeated, right, and so on. But again, it cannot account for things like knowledge sensitivity and what even are propensities. Right? One might worry on kind of grounds of being modest about our metaphysical commitments, that we don't want those kind of things floating around that we're not able to really define in operational ways. Good. So let's look at one of those challenges that certainly points an arrow toward more Bayesian interpretations of probability. Right? The fact that it appears that the probabilities that we want to assign to events changes based on our knowledge state. Is essentially dependent on them. So let's introduce our dear friend, the probabilist from Stanford, Percy Diaconis. Right? And one thing about Percy is, as a child, he ran away and joined the circus, and he learned quite a few very impressive tricks. One of them is to flip a coin in such a way that he knows precisely whether it will land heads or tails. Right? So now imagine Percy is sitting there, and
have to tax it. I was just wondering whether he has to tax it.
he has what?
When he bets on that, that's how he makes his money as a property.
Did he have to tax it? I get the feeling that he has quite a few income streams. So now, look at the situation from two perspectives. Percy, who's flipping his coin, and let Percy be following the protocol such that he will ensure that the limiting relative frequency of his flips will be 1/2. We have some appropriate rule by which he does that, and he's flipping those, but for every flip, he knows precisely whether it will be heads or tails. Right? And I'm also looking at Percy, and you ask each of us, of the next flip, what's the chance of it coming up heads? Right. Well, for me, the correct probability statement is, I think it's a 1/2 chance of coming up heads. But Percy, who just knows more about the situation, right, will be like, this is 100% head, or close to, let's say 99% heads. Right. And that would be the correct statement for Percy. So this fact changes based on our knowledge state. Right. So the insight here is that it seems like appropriate probability claims depend essentially on what we know. Right. And indeed, one can generalize this to a huge range of probability claims that we make regularly. Most things that we deal with, perhaps other than certain quantum phenomena, when we're assigning probabilities to them, we are, in Laplace's terms, expressing some essential features about our cognitive state. Right? That is to say, if you were Laplace's demon, right, events would not be having the same probability that they have for me. You would be like Percy with respect to a very wide range of phenomena. Indeed, if we think about coin flips, why do they have that 50% property in general? It's because if you look at this nice graph of the relationship between the angular momentum and velocity, right, under very sensitive perturbations of these parameters, you end up in regions of landing heads or tails. In such a way that if you were just to say, I don't have the ability to discern, unlike Percy, that level of fine grain, right? Under this kind of physical process, it's very reasonable if you just integrate over some region there to say half the time I expect it to come up heads and half the time tails. But if you get sharp enough, and you know precisely where you are, right, and those features of the physical environment, you can make much more precise probability statements. That said, there's a fun aside, piece by Andrew Kellman and Deborah Nolan, which even though the fiction of the bias coin is a common pedagogical one across probabilistic reasoning, they go through why it's physically just about impossible to make bias coin. Good. So this leads us to our last interpretation. And within this family of interpretation, these kind of epistemic interpretations that account for this knowledge dependence of probability, right, we'll see some variation. Here, we're talking about probabilities as interpreted as either degrees of belief, as kind of betting odds to which we're willing to commit under the right incentive structures. And there's a host of other ways that one can spell this out. Things like the numbers that we would report if incentivized by something like a proper scoring rule that elicits certain attitudes, or under some accounts, they want to think about a generalization of sentential logic, of the simple portions of logic to partial entailment relations. Now, each of these has kind of a storied history, and they're not mutually exclusive. They all fall into the sort of account, right, that says that whatever these are, they're epistemic states that are in part a contribution of my mind and in part the world. Right?
So what does partial entailment mean?
So if you think of full entailment, right, just now give it in degrees, and that's supposed to be from the kind of Carnappian positive tradition, what probability they're giving you.
Okay.
So the 50% on the coin flip is a partial entailment to that measure. Good. That said, from the Bayesian perspective, right, cashing out probability in terms of degrees of belief, these other interpretations are compatible insofar as they can be used as follows. One, certainly observed frequencies, not saying anything about hypothetical limiting relative frequencies, are going to inform your degrees of belief under a reasonable account. And further, you can look at things like propensity. Certainly these are psychologically very natural attitudes for us to impose on things. We all think in terms of, dispositions of objects. But you might want a more naturalistic account, and indeed, Bruno Definetti showed us a way to express those commitments to chance or hypotheses just in terms of symmetry properties of our degrees of belief. In particular, it shows that if you want to talk about what are IID random variables, you can talk about exchangeable sequences of random variables, and so on. So you can have your degrees of belief without chances. Right? You can just say, look, at the end of the day, when I talk about chances, right, I'm talking about expectations over observables. And they're just a shorthand way to talk about what I expect, right, and the structure of my degrees of belief. Indeed, there's other work that shows kind of similar results for things like causation. Maybe you don't like causes, you didn't like chances floating around. Right? Maybe you don't want to be fully committed to some strong metaphysical notion of causation. Right? Certainly the sort of causation captured by, say, the Pearl, Mohseni, and Furdy's account of causation in their causal models, right, can be shown again to be in many ways reducible to Definetti-style symmetry properties of our beliefs. Right? So you can say, give me your DAG or whatever causal structure you're thinking about, and let me tell you about the kind of degrees of belief, the properties of your degrees of belief, and you don't have to be committed to causes flying around. So we get here, right, in our first pass of the many degrees of Bayesianism, that what the Bayesian accounts share, even though they have, can have potentially different ways of cashing it out, is a commitment to probability as degrees of belief. Something that can subsume things like propensities and chances and frequencies and describe these range of phenomena. With intimate connections, as you'll see tomorrow in our next talk, to decision making. Right? We'll see that these probability judgments are foundationally tied to theories of rational decision. Right? So why don't we think of the next decision point for the variety of Bayesian stuff.
Cool. Let's see, how does this work? There we go. Yeah, so I have to say this, Aydin is so good. Beautiful slides. And I don't share his same gifts. Well, so probabilism, well, that's the part of Bayesianism that says that there's sort of a rational norm that everybody should have probabilistic credences. Credences should be representable as probabilities. And philosophers and others have offered lots of different arguments for probabilism. There's many beyond the ones that are listed here, but oftentimes philosophers will lump them into these three sort of categories. And if you open a sort of introductory textbook on Bayesian epistemology, you'll see these are most common arguments. So there's some, you can divide them into pragmatic arguments and epistemic arguments. So pragmatic arguments are going to somehow with preference, or trying to argue that if we're sort of rationally, in a practical sense, rationally consistent, then we'll have credences that are probabilistic. And some people worry that's too dirty, pragmatic. We want something purely epistemic. It's just about epistemic values like truth and all. And those give rise to the epistemic arguments. Okay, so among the pragmatic arguments is Dutch book arguments and representation theorems, which people have probably heard of, but we'll talk sort of about the general structure of these arguments. So Dutch book arguments associated with different people. This is Bruno de Finetti. This starts with the idea that sort of Aydin had alluded to in his presentation, that there's a connection between our dispositions to bet on different propositions and our credences. In fact, you make it very strong and just identify your credence in a particular proposition with the fair price that you'd pay for a bet that's going to give you $1 if that proposition turns out to be true, and nothing otherwise. So we assume here you value money linearly. So a Dutch book is just any collection of bets, each of which you individually judge to be fair. It's okay, this is a fair price for this bet. But if you took them all collectively, it would for sure lead to show loss. You know that once all the bets are settled, you're going to end up with less money than you settled. Okay, so there's always sort of thought in epistemology that if you can construct a Dutch book against an agent, that shows there's something irrational about them or something bad about them. Right? And so the idea of Dutch book arguments for probabilism, we're going to try to show that, well, if you violate probabilism, we can make a Dutch book. So we can come up with a set of bets, each of which you'll individually judge to be fair, but which collectively will lead you to show loss. Right? And that's the content of the classic Dutch book theorem, as it applies to probabilism. But if your credences violate any of the probability axioms, and I'm given this assumption that we're identifying your credences with your fair prices for these bets, then a Dutch book can be constructed against you. Right? Which I guess people like definiting, that's bad, and that supports the thesis that probabilism is a genuine norm of rationality. Of course, you have to worry at first, right? Just because something bad happens when probabilism isn't satisfied doesn't necessarily mean you're in the clear, because you have to worry about, well, maybe bad stuff just always happens. Maybe everybody's Dutch bookable or whatever. So that's the importance of converse Dutch book theorems, right? So you want to wonder, if you do have probabilistic credences, are you going to escape this problem? And there's been various versions of converse Dutch book theorems, proved as they apply to probabilism. And basically say if your credences do satisfy the probability axioms, then at least Dutch books of the sort that we can construct against the non-probabilistic agent don't apply to you. Right? Now when I say other sort, well, there might be other kinds of Dutch book stuff like conditional bets, and if we allow diachronic Dutch books, across time, then satisfaction of the probability axioms, having probabilistic credences, isn't sufficient to guarantee you're not going to face a Dutch book. But you won't face the kinds of Dutch books you're going to face if you're non-probabilistic credences. Okay, so then that generates this Dutch book argument, which you can state in a really simple form like this. Right? Dutch books can't be constructed against rational agents. That's this normative premise about rationality, what it entails. But then we have the content of the Dutch book theorems, that Dutch books can be constructed against agents with non-probabilistic credences, so therefore agents with non-probabilistic credences can't be.
So I think that the hidden assumption, one hidden assumption there in those arguments is that it's something like that your buying price and selling price for a bet are the same, right?
Yes. Yeah. I'm assuming that the fair price is both the price you'd be willing to buy or sell at the fair price, and there's one single fair price.
Yeah, because when you're doing like imprecise probabilities, you just have different prices.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Both in turn. You first and you. Yeah.
If I remember correctly, like one of the assumptions was that the agents here are like myopic or like assume some like very specific decision rule about like what sort of bets you're allowed to see in the future. And I was always kind of confused about that because if you are like if you know what bets are ahead of you, then you can just like avoid all sorts of Dutch book by like pre-committing to like I'm not going to take these set of bets if it's going to lead me to being Dutch book.
Yes.
But if you also like restrict the agent to like only being able to see like some sort of bets and some sort of like Dutch books and not, then that's kind of like you're getting Dutch because you have like lack of knowledge, not necessarily because of lack of rationality. So
Yes.
I was confused about this.
Yeah, these are. I think if I understand what you're getting at, correct me if I'm not. Is that relates to sort of like the what sort of fair prices you assign to bets might be sort of context sensitive. It might depend on what other bets you've already accepted or what bets you anticipate are going to be offered in the future. Oftentimes, right, at least some people talk about these Dutch book arguments, sort of assume you're like given just a list of all like the bets up front and you like post your fair prices for all the bets on just like the same piece of paper now. And then you want to make sure that they're all probabilistic because if they weren't, they'd be Dutch bookable. But then you can ask like, is that really getting at your credences though? Because that's like, now you've like had to state all your fair prices for all these different propositions at the same time. Maybe you would have stated different numbers for some of the propositions if you just had to bet on them and didn't have to like identify your fair prices for everything. So that is a kind of objection. Was I picking up on what you were
Right.
point you're making? Or?
I think so. Although I still don't understand. I guess I still don't get why Dutch book then is like a valid like normative argument for probabilism.
Yeah, I mean, so if we identify your credence with, so let's say if you have to post your fair prices for all the different propositions that you might be asked about, right? If we identify your credence with that, it's the fair price you post when you have to, list your fair prices for all the different propositions. Then it seems like you should put down probabilities. If you don't put down probabilities, someone can construct a Dutch book against you. But then maybe that's too like maybe you don't like that identification of credence with that the fair prices you put under that condition.
I think it's an interesting question. What kind of argument for something like probabilism you could get if you assume that you can be like forward looking or backward looking?
Yeah, I guess like my point was that like if you assume that agents are not just myopic in choosing the bets that are like immediately like favorable, and like if you can do things like backwards induction, you can like create situations where like even if you're not necessarily like probabilistic, like if you don't have probabilistic beliefs, you can't be Dutch book. Like seeing like all the bets at the, like outcomes at the very end, like only taking those paths, even though like locally like it might look like you're not choosing again like in your favor. So I was
I think we're thinking just sort of a synchronic set here where you just have a sheet of paper and you've got to put your fair prices for all the different propositions down on it.
So perhaps what you're saying, we can come back to it when we think of diachronic Dutch books that occur over time. This is synchronic, this is at a moment.
okay.
Yeah, but I think there is a real worry that I think is related to what you're saying in terms of this context sensitivity stuff. Where if you anticipate being offered additional bets in the future, or you've already been offered bets in the past that you don't know how they're going to be settled yet, that might change the situation. It might be a different situation than if you're just putting your fair price down on one proposition and you don't anticipate future bets.
Isn't it in general the case that every Dutch book argument assumes that the bookie is in some sense like knows more or is smarter than you?
Can't know more.
Yeah, can't know more than more. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good. Yes, in that.
I was wondering, so you mentioned the setting where you have to put down all your prices at the same time, having seen the complete list. Can you also make the same argument if you are in the setting where you can essentially present each bet individually to the agent in a separate universe, like in counterfactual, and then you would be able to construct like a
So like we imagine like I offer them a bet on proposition X in this world, and in another world I offer them a bet on proposition Y,
right.
and they don't add up to the number that I'd get if I offered them a bet on this, in this third world on X or Y or something. So
I mean, like, so you would be able to point out, even though the agent might be like context sensitive in the way in which it assigns bets, you could say like, if you could like get it to bet in different universes, having only seen like each bet individually, you could construct a Dutch book if it doesn't assign credences.
I mean, so what are you thinking? Like it's like a cross-world Dutch book, or is the Dutch book happening within a particular world? There's a particular world where they're subject to Dutch book. Because I think that's where people find it most forceful. Like you have a particular world where.
I mean, like once you get all the bets, right?
Uh-huh.
Can't you just like combine them and that's a Dutch book?
I mean, so you have to assume that the agent would be willing to take them all in the same world, right? So I thought initially the common sense here was like, yeah, I'd offer this price for a bet on X in this world, where I'm not offered a bet on Y. But in this other world where I'm also offered a bet on Y, I change the price I'd offer for X.
I thought.
After. Is that kind of? Okay, we'll come back. Okay, I can use Dutch books for other try to justify other things besides probabilism, sometimes connections between conditional and unconditional credences, the form of the ratio rule, reflection principle, and so on. These different sorts of Dutch book arguments. So one kind of worry that some people have about the Dutch book arguments is the kind of rationality that appears in the premise, right? So Dutch books can't be constructed against rational agents. I don't really think that's like the kind of rationality that appears there is practical rationality. It's agents who like achieve well, don't lose money unnecessarily. And so that's the kind of, right, if the arguments we valid, that's also the kind of rationality that's showing up in the conclusions. The conclusion is that practically rational agents are going to have to be probabilistic or can't be non-probabilistic. Right? But something I think we want to worry about epistemic rationality. Yes?
Is the whole discussion about rationality, I mean, one of the things we know that humans are not rational in the naive sense. However, there is increasing evidence that if you take into account decision cost, so informational decision cost, things like what Daniel Brown and other people that have done, you get back essentially rationality. Now my question to you is, of course, what is kind of linked to probability theory? Because obviously there's something missing in this this information cost or this decision cost. How would that fit into this model, or how do you get rid of this?
Yeah. So this is a very idealized kind of setting. There are thoughts about like ideal rationality. We're thinking like you don't have computational limitations and so on. And so in that context, the thought is okay. If you're ideally rational, you shouldn't be able to construct a Dutch book against. Nobody should be able to construct a Dutch book against you. That would reveal a flaw.
How would the inclusion of computational cost fit into this type of scenario?
And so there might be cases where I guess it would be you're thinking it would be rational to have credences that are such that you would accept a Dutch book because it'd be too costly to try to
Exactly. So
massage the
basically, the
credences.
cost of making a decision at a certain level. Think of utility function. You get this signal. In principle, you could resolve the whole state, but you have only so and so many bits available per second, and so the best compromise is some kind of rate distortion trade-off between the utility you want to achieve and the information you are ready to pursue. It's like saying, okay, you have to write an essay until tomorrow morning.
Yes. Yeah.
There's no way you can read all the literature.
Yeah.
You try
Yeah.
to do your very best time available.
Yeah. I mean, you want to go, Cecile?
Well, I was just going to say, I wonder if the constraint of, okay, so the person designing the Dutch book against you can't know more about the world than you do. If you impose a constraint that the person designing the Dutch book doesn't have more time to consider the world or time to design this as you do, then you get back the same thing.
But the question is really whether it's the right thing to do to impose the constraint on the challenger rather than the agent, because the Dutch book design is a challenger. It's the person that puts a challenge to you. So the question is, can we formulate the Dutch book loss, like saying, well, the Dutch book loss, there is a loss, but that loss is the best loss you can achieve if you have this computational power available to make your challenger would be constrained. That would be an interesting question, but I think if you do that, you essentially get a game, an information game between two agents that are both informationally constrained. I don't think that's what you are having here.
I think my instinct was something like, you shouldn't accept the Dutch book from somebody who knows more about the world than you do. Equally, you shouldn't accept the Dutch book from somebody who has way more thinking time than you do.
Well, you do buy cars, right, from used cars.
So, and then like, yeah, you get the market for lemons and everything collapses and it's like, yeah.
You don't have the choice, right? You have to play this game,
Yeah.
and the point is really now, what's the best game you can play in the situation given, right? So I do think that the
Yeah.
Dutch book challenger is all-knowing, and they can do whatever they want. But in the moment you challenge them, I think the whole thing becomes a multi-agent problem, I would say.
Dan?
I'll just say quickly, it's not exactly the Dutch book context, but in terms of a cost for thinking,
Right.
there's this nice paper by Lippmann called How to Decide, How to think stuff. And there it formalizes the idea that when you're making kind of object level decision, you might also have the ability to spend more time with thinking and doing some computation. There's a cost with it. But then of course there's the next level decision, which is should you decide to make that decision. And he shows that there is a fixed point in this, if you keep looking at the higher order decisions.
Okay.
Now I think there's maybe some dubious stuff because the fixed point is not a natural number. It has to be like a higher order cardinal. So it's a very fun paper to read, but there is a fixed point.
What's the title of the
That's
paper?
a continuous
It's called How to
hypothesis.
Decide, How to
Okay.
by Lippmann.
Okay, cool.
Barton Lippmann. I think it's a nice kind of way of at least formalizing this kind of thing, not in the Dutch book context, but more just in general, putting cost in explicitly into an expected utility model. It's a fun thing.
What's the author name?
Barton Lippmann.
Yes.
Barton L.
Yes, yeah. Yes. Aydin?
Yeah, I was thinking one thing that might be helpful as we're kind of trying to cover content is, and I think Gerard could articulate from his own perspective as well, is that I think that it is a mistake in the literature that sometimes folk focus inordinately on one or the other justification for probabilism or conditioning. Some of us think of the set of arguments together as a whole as pointing out, right, some properties of interest. Very much the same way that we have, say, in terms of for computability theory. We have this intuitive notion of, right, what it means to be computable, and you notice that under very different approaches, you get the same answer out, right? Whether you start with finite register machines, or Turing machines, or the sigma calculus, you say, it picks out one thing, right? I think very similarly, many of us, for example, feel the Dutch book theorem is something like a dramatization. It's one way of getting at, if your, betting behavior exhibits this kind of property, that doesn't seem great. But then you go through the accuracy argument, you go through, importantly, the representation theorems, and you look at the content of those theorems and axes. And I think that is where often, as a whole, this body is compelling for us. So whether I get drunk in a traumatization of a Dutch book isn't on its own, right, that interesting.
Yeah, I think maybe when I'm looking at it as well, especially if you're not as much concerned with the purely practical side, is that it's kind of it's meant to show you that if you take a fixed point in time where you don't update your credences at all, you're just kind of looking at the world in two different ways. That you kind of, when I'm looking at it and carving it up one way, these kind of look fair, and when we kind of take a step back, I lose money. Really what that's showing is, it's just the same thing, and I'm just like, depending on how you phrase it, I have a different view of that, and that's kind of showing a schizophrenic attitude towards the world.
And I think that some of these people are great. Ben, Gerard, Daniel, for going more in the weeds of some of these arguments. That's it for now, for our primer. I think getting a picture from above, here's a set of arguments. They seem to point out to one thing. That seems interesting. And we also want to look at insights and open questions, especially some of the last areas I think will be of interest to some of the folk here when you see fundamental problems with the Bayesian approach, limitations, and can think about, right, what the frontiers are. So I do want to.
On that, well then I guess I should speak
We
first.
should push on.
Let's push on to representation theorems. Okay. So this is probably somewhat familiar, right? Right, so on the classic sort of Bayesian picture, preferences go by expected utility, and expected utility is determined by two things: utilities and your probabilities. Your utility is a representation of your desires, your probability is some of it a representation of your beliefs. There we go. So there's different ways that different people have looked at this. So one way of looking at Dave Finetti and his Dutch book stuff is we sort of assume the expected utility principle. We assume that your preferences correspond to expected utility. And we assume that we know your utilities, for say money, and then we try to infer from that what are your probabilities. I'm going to do that again. Quick for you. There we go. Different approach is von Neumann and Morgenstern, right? They take the probabilities as given, ask you for your preferences over different lotteries. And they assume that your preferences over lotteries are going to correspond to expected utility maximization, and from that assumption, they're able to derive and figure out what your utility function is. There we go. The genius of Ramsey was to figure out a way to just assume one of these and then derive the other two, right? So Ramsey assumes your preferences go by expected utility maximization, and then tries to derive from that what are your probabilities and utilities going to be. Right? It's also what Savage did, and a lot of these different people have proven different representation theorems and decision theory. Right? So assume the stuff about the structure of your preferences, and then try to derive what your probabilities and utilities are. Okay, so how do people use representation theorem to try to argue for probabilism? So I have vaguely a structure like this, right? So we first posit rational agents are going to have preferences that satisfy some axiom set. Different representation theorems for different axiom sets. The axioms are supposed to be intuitively appealing stuff, preferences should be transitive, things like that. Different sorts of dominance principles. But preferences that satisfy axiom set X, so there's the representation theorem part of the argument, can be represented as expected utility maximizing relative to the probabilistic credence function. Right? And then we assume, so rational agents, since their preferences have to satisfy those axioms, they should have probabilistic credence. There's also different ways people can object to representation theorems as justifications of probabilism. The most obvious way is objecting to the axioms, right? So I don't think, maybe I'll skip the Allais paradox for time, but there's different ways that you can object to the assumption that people have preferences that correspond to the different axiom systems. More generally, you can try to challenge the inference from the premises of the representation theorem argument to the conclusion that your credences are probabilistic. So consider this kind of a case. Suppose Brian is somebody who has a probabilistic credence function, and he uses it to compute. Yes.
The Allais paradox.
Yes.
Isn't that exactly one of the things that what the decision cost when you incorporate it? I don't know. I mean, this question would actually resolve. So in the moment when you say, in the moment I have to pay for uncertainty. Can this resolve the Allais paradox?
So the Allais paradox is super controversial. People have lots of different views on it. Some people think it's actually totally compatible with the classic expected utility approach once you just define the outcomes finally enough. You're if $1 million, if money's not really all you care about, but you also care about the possibility that you would have had regret in another scenario if things had turned out differently or something, then you gotta redescribe your outcomes so it's not just money, and then you can satisfy all the expected utility axioms. But we can try to make assumptions that that's not the case. Money really is all you care about.
I don't want to trick. I don't want to play tricks here.
Yeah.
I basically say uncertainty has cost. We see that when you go for lotteries. We see that when you prepare to buy or not buy shares, and when you prepare for war, or whatever.
Yeah.
It certainly has a cost, a real monetary cost.
Yeah.
So that's why I make. But anyway.
So that sounds like it's either a redescription sort of strategy today. So it's which would be, and if we want to make it like monetary, so it's like really there's monetary stuff going on, then I think we're like kind of changing the decision problem. We're saying this is like too idealized. It's not a problem agents would actually face.
Okay.
But in the case we're supposed to imagine, like, this is the decision problem.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so suppose Brian's somebody who has probabilistic credences, and he uses them to compute the expected utility of X, and he forms his preferences according to that. Is there another dude, Simon, who has a non-probabilistic credence function that's identical to the square root of Brian's. So he just takes all of Brian's credences and he takes the square root of them. Right? That'll be non-probabilistic, right? It'll still assign like 1 to tautologies and 0 to contradictions, but we'll mess up additivity and all that stuff. However, Simon takes a non-expected utility approach to forming his preferences. He weights outcomes by the square of his credence. Right? Then Simon and Brian are going to end up with exactly the same preferences. Right? So they have different credences, but Simon's also changed his decision rule to account for that. So they end up with the same preferences, which means they're going to satisfy all the same axioms on different preference sets. And so they can both be represented as maximizing expected utility relative to a particular probabilistic credence function, namely Brian's probabilistic credence function. But does that mean that Simon has the probabilistic credence function? And this is kind of a debate about whether we want to be like just representationalists about credence, or having credences of certain sort is just a matter of being representable as having them, or if you're more of a realist and you think no, it's more than that. Yeah.
On two sides of that.
Just wondering, do you mean square and square root?
I meant square root first. Yeah, it was a typo. It was like, the first square should be a square root, and then the second one is a square.
Okay.
And as you put it, for some of us, the cash value of the framework at the end of the day is the choice behavior. It's a set of things that we do that changes the stuff in the world. So we just care about representable as and the answers that you get, right? With not a deep commitment to interpretations of probability and utility. And in some frameworks, you can trade them fungibly. Others have stronger commitments to what probabilities are, what utilities are.
Yes.
And by extension, it looks like you could have any power.
We could have lots of different kinds of non-probabilistic credence functions that we transform in different ways, and then we just have to have different decision rules to correspond.
There's a very special power. You take the square root and you have quantum mechanics.
That's what's privileged. That's what's privileged. Okay. Let's see. Yes.
25.
25 minutes. Okay. So we'll go through this fast. So all that was like dirty pragmatics argument, right? So some people want like purely epistemic arguments for probabilism, right? So the idea here, right, and popularized in philosophy by a number of people, Jim Joyce, Richard Pettigrew, it is that like, you want your credences to approximate the truth. What does that mean? Well, like, let's say we like represent truth with like the number 1, and we represent falsehood with the number 0. Right? What you'd like to have is you'd like to have your credences match the truth. Right? You'd like to have credence 1 and all the things that are true. You'd like to have credence 0 and all the things that are false. That would be like ideal. Right? But unfortunately, we're not omniscient, right? We can't do that. Right? The truth value function is a probability function. Right? But like we probably can't have that probability function as our credences, right? But we'd like to have like one that's close to that, right? So we try to come up with these like measures of like how close is one credence function to another, and then we want to have a credence function that's like closer than others to the truth. Right? So one very common way of measuring the inaccuracy of a set of credences, which is just its distance from like the true credences, the truth that you should have. This is a Breyer score. It's not the only one to get out. There's lots of them, but it's just like super common and kind of intuitive. Right? So you're just going to take your credence in you're going to take your whole credence function. You're going to look at your credence in each particular proposition. You're going to look at the difference between that number and the truth value of the proposition. You're going to square it, and you're going to add them all up. And that'll be your inaccuracy measure. If you were omniscient, you'd get a Breyer score of 0, which would be like the best you could do. Higher numbers, you mean you're more and more inaccurate. Okay?
It's just a squared loss function.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Who decides on the square?
Why is it square here? This is Glenn Breyer did that. That's going to be one of like the main objections of like why do we use this particular scoring rule?
I mean, I think one argument you could
small differences, right? And the square is really critical. Once you enter this territory, you can start running entropy and whatever. You have all.
But the RLCP is only dependent on these.
There's also some
Which one?
The square transaction.
also if you each x as a different dimension, then by this you are getting the square root of the Euclidean distance.
Euclidean distance won't work.
Yeah.
Yeah, the argument doesn't work for Euclidean distance. It works for any additive Bregman divergence, and Euclidean distance it won't work.
Come to Ben's talk.
You'll get the whole
details of all
this.
this.
Yeah.
Ben's going to talk about.
Right.
So maybe I'll skip through. I'll just give you the general kind of argument, but then Ben talks more about this.
I'm not going to talk that much about accuracy dominance.
Okay,
So,
the accuracy dominance. Okay, so we can say one credence function P is accuracy dominated by that, just in case given however the truth turns out, whatever world is actual, the Breyer score of P is going to be greater than that of Q. P will be more inaccurate than Q. Right? So you sort of almost like you always want to have Q rather than P, because no matter how the world turns out, it's going to be your accuracy goes to bed. Okay, well then sort of the way these arguments go is you can argue that credences that are non-probabilistic are going to be accuracy dominated by some probability function, by some credences that are probabilistic. Right? And then you try to argue, of course, you have the kind of converse argument that that's not going to happen for probability functions themselves. And then you can run this kind of argument. You think credences that are accuracy dominated, irrational, non-probabilistic credence functions have that property, probabilistic ones don't. Therefore, credences that violate the probability axioms are. That's the kind of argument. Okay, we could show pictures, but I'll probably skip time. Okay, and then different kinds of objections like why the Breyer score. Again, there's other things like Euclidean distance that seem kind of intuitive, maybe as measure distance, that where the argument's not going to work. There's lots of responses to that, so they say, well, you need to have like a proper scoring rule. And there's all these debates about propriety and whether it's like question bugging to assume that the scoring rule has to be proper. Then you have debates about like dominance, whether the dominance principles like in unrestricted setting are not like totally legit, right? Maybe you're like, what credence function you adopt like influences what world ends up being actual, and that could lead to weird things. So there's all those kinds of objections. I'm gonna skip one. Okay. All right. So this was just gonna be a brief mention of alternatives to probabilism. So this is just alternatives to like thinking about credences as these like single numbers, right? Which I'll probably go through really fast. How much time do we have?
About
20
minutes.
20 minutes. Okay, so these are still, there's lots of alternatives to probabilism, lots of alternatives to Bayesianism. These two, thinking in terms of comparative probability and imprecise probability, are still kind of like broadly Bayesian. They stay within like the same general family. But we're just no longer thinking of credences as necessarily tied to like particular numbers. So what's a comparative probability? Comparative probability is a binary relation on our original algebra, where if x is preferred to y here, that means x is at least as likely as y. So we're basically ranking all the different propositions in our algebra according to how likely we take them to be. Right? And then we can think about like different axioms that we think should hold for a comparative probability. So these ones are the axioms that De Finetti came up with, right? Maybe some of them are pretty intuitive, like the ranking should be transitive. The tautology should be strictly more likely than the contradiction. Everything's at least as likely as a contradiction. You can have a qualitative analog of additivity. It says, right, if x is mutually exclusive with y, and y is mutually exclusive with, if x is mutually exclusive with z, as I have the notation here, and y is mutually exclusive with z, then if x is going to be more likely than y, if and only if x union z is more likely than y union z. So you can tack on z. That makes sense. I like how it goes with, if you want to be able to represent this comparative probability with a numerical probability, you're going to need that. Okay, so De Finetti, so this is kind of the tab we'd often like to be able to represent our comparative probability judgments with a probability measure. And that can give you another kind of argument for probabilism. If you like directly try to argue first for the axioms on your comparative probabilities, and then you argue, oh, well, if a comparative probability satisfies these axioms, then it'll be representable by a numerical probability function. Right? So that's what you kind of like. De Finetti conjectured that this would be sufficient to guarantee representability by a probability measure. It was famously proven in this Kraft, Pratt, and Seidenberg paper that those axioms are not sufficient. They were kind of convoluted, not intuitive, not all that intuitive example to show this. So that set people working on like what would work. They had like a proposal for like an additional axiom you could add that would guarantee sufficiency. The most common one that people don't talk about is this axiom from Dana Scott. They proposed later, Scott's axiom. Not as intuitive as the original De Finetti axioms, but it does give you necessary and sufficient conditions for representation of a comparative probability. Yeah, so this basically said if you take two sets of propositions in your algebra that have the same number of them, right? So
number of elements. Yeah,
same number of elements, right? And they're guaranteed as a matter of logic to have the same number of truths in them. So that's what it means to be isovalent. So if they were both partitions, that would be an example of isovalence because they'd each be guaranteed to have exactly one truth in them. But there could be other things besides partitions that are also.
So are we treating each of them as Boolean variables?
Yeah, these are all just propositions in our algebra. Yeah. Okay, so that's kind of weird. It's like if you take two sets that are isovalent that have to have the exact same number of truths in them as a matter of logic, then if say AI, A2 maybe, it's strictly more likely than B2, then it's got to be the case that that's like offset somewhere by one of the B propositions being more likely than one of the A propositions. I mean, that kind of makes sense if you think about them as partitions like that. That's kind of intuitive. It's a little bit hard to see for in total generality, but
that's not so bad.
It's not so bad. It's not so bad. So if you add that, you get the necessary sufficient condition. Yeah.
A thought.
Yes.
We're probably at this rate not going to get through even diachronic arguments.
I'm gonna skip the diachronic arguments. Yeah. All right. Okay, so I already said that, but okay, yeah. There's a uniqueness problem. The general won't be unique. So different people have tried to add like different conditions to try to get unique probability representation. Let's talk about conditional probability. Okay, I'm gonna skip that. All right. I mean, one way you might like object to the completeness of comparative probability. You might think that like sometimes it's just not clear if A is more likely than B or B is more likely than A or equally likely. Just leave that out. In those kind of cases, you might like hope for like representation by a whole set of probability measures, where proposition X is going to be judged more likely than Y, in which case all the members of your set of probabilities say that X is more likely than Y. There's different conditions you can put on your comparative probability to get representation by a set of probability measures in that way. That's consistent with general imprecise Bayesianism. I was going to go through the Ellsberg paradox as an example to motivate the imprecise stuff. And then I was going to talk about some examples or alleged objections or problems for agents whose credences are represented by whole sets of probability measures instead of single probabilities. But I will leave all that out. And
a thought. Do you
yes.
want to break up our talk and carve out another event later that we?
We could, or we could go to what is. What do you?
Yeah. Maybe we could schedule a follow-up session. We'll be out of time in like 15 minutes.
I'll
because I don't want you to skip all the good content, like alternative.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking alternatives to. Okay.
That's great.
All right. So I'm going to talk about alternative updating procedures. So I think Aydin had already mentioned how probabilism is one part of Bayesianism, right? The thesis that credences should be probabilistic, but Bayesianism has more commitments than just probabilism. Conditionalization is also a commitment, right? You learn if your learning experience is factored by coming to be certain in a particular proposition, then your new probabilities should just be your old probabilities conditional on that proposition you learned. But that's only going to apply in like some cases, right? Cases where your learning experience is adequately modeled in that way, right? Could there be like more general learning experiences? Right? Okay, so this is Richard Jeffrey, a philosopher who's famous for generalizing conditionalization and giving some examples that just to motivate this. So this is an example taken from Jeffrey. So suppose you're considering the color of a particular piece of cloth, and you're doing this by like, you're going to end up examining the cloth under non-ideal lighting conditions. So you don't expect to like see for sure what the color of the cloth is going to be. But initially, there's three possibilities. Either the cloth's green, it's blue, or it's violet. And these are your initial probabilities. You're like that, 30% that it's green, 30% that it's blue, 40% that it's violet. And then you get this learning experience. You get to go in and examine the cloth under these non-ideal lighting conditions, learning by candlelight. And you don't become totally confident of what the color of the cloth is, but you don't stay the same as you were before. You do have a genuine learning experience. Cloth looks pretty green, so you up green goes up to 70%, blue 25%, now violet's only 5%. Right? So you have a learning shift, but it's not captured by learning any particular proposition for certain. It's captured by spreading your probabilities in a new way over some partition that was relevant to your experience. So what should you do in that case? How should the rest? So we now have what your new probabilities are for the colors, but what should your new probabilities be for other propositions, right? That might be probabilistically dependent on what the color of the cloth was. Maybe what the color of the cloth in the room next door is going to be. Jeffrey gave this formula for that. It's often called Jeffrey conditionalization. He called it probability kinematics. Your new probability in a proposition should be your old probability in the proposition conditional on each of the cells of the partition that was relevant to your learning experience, but each one weighted by your new probability for that cell being the actual one, which is given by your learning experience, and then you add them all up, and that's your new probability index. Right? So old standard conditionalization would be a special case of this, right? If you learned that the cloth was green for certain, that would go to 100%. Everything else would fall away except for the old probability of x given green. Okay, but there might be even more general learning cases. So maybe things like
you can also reduce this thing to classical thing by just adding more stuff into your event space.
yes, totally, totally. That's Daniel's favorite. Yeah, you could try to expand the algebra, and then you get more weird propositions.
That's an important point that you
yes,
can retrieve this in the classical context.
Yeah. Although how easy that is to do might be difficult. When you think about the richness of actual sensory experience and stuff, actually having a proposition that corresponds to it in my algebra to begin with might be difficult. That was motivation for that. Okay, but maybe there's other sorts of learning experiences that are even more general than the ones that Jeffrey considered. Maybe we get new information that's not really even captured exactly as spreading your probabilities in a new way over a new partition, right? So a classic example in the philosophy literature. This is the Judy Benjamin problem. So here we were imagining, right, Judy Benjamin is private, who's out in war and enemy territory. She parachutes in, and there's two camps. There's the red camp and the blue camp, and they each have two sections to them. The first section of the camp and the second section of the camp. So there's 4 possibilities for where Judy could have landed. She's not exactly sure where she did land. In fact, she's indifferent between all the possibilities. She's 25% chance she's in each of the possible places. But then right before her radio cuts out, it's radioed into her that if you're in the red section, if you're by the red camp, then it's 3 to 1 odds that you're in the first section, right? And not the second section, right? And then the radio cuts out. So that's a weird learning experience. It seems what she really learned there was some conditional probabilities. She's learned okay, the probability of being in one conditional on being in red is different than I thought it was to begin with. Right? So what should she do there? How should she update in light of these new conditional probabilities? Maybe people propose different things. So this is a generalization of Jeffrey conditionalization called Adams conditionalization. It's supposed to apply to when you learn directly new information about conditional probabilities. Philosopher Richard Bradley's proposed. And then there's you can think even more generally than this, just you get a learning experience that's just captured by some constraint, right? That your new probabilities have to have some feature to them. Right? So your learning experience is just captured by some set of probability measures, all the probability measures that share that feature. Then you ask, what can you do then? And some thought it was kind of intuitive, maybe you should minimize the distance between your prior credences and your posterior credences subject to this constraint. So your posterior has to be somewhere inside the constraint, and you want it to be as close to your prior as you can get while staying inside the constraint. Of course, that then invites similar questions to what we thought about in the accuracy context, about different measures of distance between credence functions. Like the most popular one, at least in a lot of this literature, is relative entropy. Right? So relative entropy is like a measure of the amount of extra information in one probability measure compared to another that's used as a baseline. So you can use like your prior as the baseline and try to minimize relative entropy amongst all the probability measures that satisfy this constraint. That's the definition of relative entropy.
Is this scale divisions?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Nice feature about this, it could give us, if we wanted, like another argument for conditioning. If in a special case where your constraint is just given by, come to have certainty in this one particular proposition, if you want to minimize relative entropy, you should use conditionalization. Same thing with Jeffrey conditionalization, if your learning constraints given by some sort of Jeffrey learning experience. Okay. Cool. And then we go back to you.
5 minutes.
Yeah.
5 minutes? Sorry it takes so long.
I would just mention that for those of you who feel like continuing, and if the next session lines up with what you want, the way we're going to continue is looking at limitations of the Bayesian account, its challenges and open questions for that part. Here, I might quickly move through a few of the significant contributions and insights that come from the broad framework. I'll do it very quickly. I'm going to punt questions and then we can just talk over discussion. We have 5 minutes. So one feature that is a desirable property of the framework is that we have guarantee from certain mathematical results, for those of you who know the Martingale convergence theorem, that if a Bayesian agent has positive probability on the hypothesis, she will, in the limit, converge in probability to believing that hypothesis. So if we think of it in the case of a parameter, right, her expectation for the parameter will converge in probability to the parameter as data accumulates. Now, those results have been generalized to a number of contexts. Indeed, some of the most general contexts of non-parametric inference have been developed by folks like Shervish and Wasserman. It teaches us things about rational disagreement. Right? That is to say, it's something that actually has impacted my practical way of engaging with people, where I try for having a discussion to look like one of these agents to some feeble approximation. Roughly what it tells you is that Bayesian agents with the same priors cannot agree to disagree. They're going to converge as they accumulate more data to the same belief. And this is generalized to not requiring the same prior. Later work showed that we just needed to have mutually absolutely continuous priors, meaning that we consider the same set of things to be possible. All right, so kind of much weaker condition on what's required. Another folk have kind of thought about what that might be and tried to kind of cash that out of them. Imagine you're born with your little baby Bayesian prior endowed to you by the evolutionary process. As long as it allows you to entertain the same set of possibility, that might suggest that.
But in this case, they actually need to keep getting new evidence, right? Because like in the original agreement theorem, it's not for them to kind of talk to each other, and they are guaranteed to converge in probability. That's the main thing. And you accept each other's probabilities. Whereas in this case, I think you need to assume something stronger, right?
That's right. We need to actually get more evidence, not just echo each other.
Yeah.
Play that exchange your credences declaration game. That's right. So there are conditions in which we thought, right, how weak and how broad a set of conditions do we get these sorts of guarantees? This is kind of generalizations to weaker conditions, and indeed, it's also the fact that.
You got a paper by Steve Hellman there?
Yeah.
No, I know him well from the intro was wrong. Yeah.
So, indeed, this is also a kind of computationally efficient process. There's a nice piece by Scott Aronson that shows you this occurs actually remarkably quickly in the right learning situations. So what is the practical thing? And what these agents look like is we don't dig in when we're solving a problem. We look like what we look like at our best when we're doing a math problem, not when we're doing politics. Is you and I might switch positions, and indeed, we'll expect in the next moment, prior to hearing what don't know which side of you I'll come down the next time you tell me what your belief is in a proposition. So this is a kind of very interesting thing, and really the only time that I see people actually behave in this way is when they're utterly truth-seeking and when they're working on the kind of problem that's conducive to that. Good. So reflection is another one of these insights from the framework, and roughly the principle of reflection says that if your current credence in a hypothesis, right, conditional in your future current credence in a hypothesis being some value, should be that value right now. Right? So if you think you're going to believe something to some degree, you should already believe that thing to that degree. And there are corollaries that have special cases that some of you might have been exposed to, and not the principle of reflection, but a weaker condition is the principle of conservation of evidence. I think that it's been articulated in Less Wrong, which is roughly your current credence is equal to your expectation of your future credence.
What did you call the previous one?
Principle of reflection.
Yeah.
And you can spell this out in special cases. These are kind of the sort of insights that tell us things like evidence must cut both ways. I can't, like some physicians say that, my treatment is such that it heals everyone except for the incurable cases. I can't have that no matter whether I do well or poorly on this treatment, right? That proposition and its negation is both supporting how well this treatment works. Indeed, there are folk who try to generalize this insight, who focus specifically on, as we're mentioning, this project of what are the core pieces of conditioning that can allow us to get at more universal principles for rational learning. This is work by Simon Hudeker and Nielsen that says, okay, why don't you just focus on this principle and allow us to consider a broader range of learning experiences. So this allows us to do things like to change our algebra propositions of how the world might be, right? To go from one to another. And kind of apropos of one of the themes that we've been articulating, once again, this is something that in the classical framework, if you just step back to a larger algebra, it can be accommodated. Like many of these elements, like Jeffrey conditioning, and so on, it turns out that if you just spell out your model more richly, you can accommodate, right, quite a rich range of the desired behaviors. So with that, let's leave it for open questions, limitations of the framework. Appreciate you all. I know that you really should join us because right now we left you with such a rosy picture.
Yeah. When will it be held?
We'll have to figure that out.
Yeah, we'll have to
That'll be
add it
on the
to the
schedule. We'll add it.
Googling principle of
Much the same
Q&A.
That's it. What I can do.
Doing some crowd work. That's right. I did not.
Actually, Bennett worked on principle.
Because, yeah, I'm not offering
But yeah, principle of reflection, we could do Bayesian epistemology.
Yeah, I think Simon
Only principle
Whittaker
of reflection
has
in general.
Simon Whittaker has great stuff on reflection. He's the person that recommended like the very general.
Okay.